their elders and their traditions and culture. This evening, it is a great pleasure to have a wonderful panel of experts on the topic of space policy for the Earth's benefit. And so I'll proceed immediately to introduce our four panellists, starting from my left, Dr. Ray Williamson, Ms. Flavia Tata Nardini, Dr. Michael Simpson, and Mr. Nicola Sasanelli. I'm not going to read out or tell you about their bios because I'm going to get them to do that themselves. And I'm going to ask each of them, starting with Flavia, could I say the youngest of our panel, how you came to be here. What has been your career?
Yep.
And how do you come to be sitting here today as an expert on space policy?
I met a man and he was Australian, so I moved to Australia, okay? So this is why I'm actually physically sitting here, and that we have to admit that he's my husband now, so it worked out quite nicely, okay? So before this love story, I'm Italian. We got two Italians today on the panel. It's really good. And from Rome, where I studied and aerospace engineering, started working in the European Space Agency quite young, was 24. Turned out that I was a kind of weird nerd on engines, propulsion, loved it. Found a job in Holland, worked there for 6-7 years. Big project manager, big projects, mainly on small satellites and propulsion systems. Kind of a rocket scientist, I guess. Really loved my job. And it was, working for a normal company, doing absolutely normal stuff, like launching small satellites to Mars, things like that. Okay. Then I met Stefano, and he was from Adelaide, and I moved to Adelaide. And then everything changed because I decided to found some companies. And so now I'm the director of two companies, LaunchBox and Fleet. So I've been an entrepreneur for the past 3 years. And mainly entered in Australia without really knowing anyone and trying to change the world with small sats. It's going quite well. I'm really tired, but really happy. So today I'm here just because it looks like what I've done in the past 2 years was quite good.
And we'll hear more about your entrepreneurial activities during the course of our panel this evening. So thank you, Flavia. Mike Simpson, Dr. Michael Simpson, you have a very close connection with this program because you were the one who came up with the idea about 7 years ago. But tell us a little bit about your career and how you became so interested in space and space policy.
Well, I started off as a kid wanting to be an astronaut, and then I got taller than 6 foot tall, and that idea went out the window. The day that the shuttle was announced to be ready to go into operation and could take people who were 6'4" to space was the same week that the Navy Reserve measured me at 6'4" and a quarter. So I had a few bad luck trips along the way to space, but was always interested in policy and law. I even did some of that while I was on active duty in the Navy. Went on to be a professor of policy and law, president of 2 universities before the International Space University called on me and said, maybe I'd like to try a third. And went to the International Space University in 2004, where I met Michael Davis, and we worked together on the first space studies program that I participated in, which was here in Adelaide in that year. From that point on, 8 years as president of the International Space University until Cinda Collins-Arsenault, a philanthropist in the United States who had started a foundation called Secure World Foundation, suborned me with the opportunity to work within about 5 miles of my grandchildren. And so for the last 5 years, I've been working with the Secure World Foundation on issues of multilateral space policy around the world. As I was sharing a little earlier, put about 180,000 miles under my keister last year in airplanes, and a lot of that going to places where some productive policy discussions are going on. So that was the journey.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Dr. Ray Williamson, I know you were the Mike Simpson's predecessor as Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation, but you have a far more interesting, well, not a far more interesting story, but a much different career journey to that point.
It's, yeah, quite different. I started out as a PhD astronomer, spent 2 years as a postdoc in University of Hawaii, and decided, gee, this is not what I want to do. I don't want to do research astronomy for the rest of my life. And I got an offer in Annapolis, Maryland, in a small college there, come teach. I did that and decided after 10 years that what I really wanted to do was policy work. So I landed a job for the US Congress in an office, dearly departed, Office of Technology Assessment. And the idea was to provide policy advice to Congress on science and technology issues. I started out in the energy program there, and people needed somebody to head up a project, and it was on space power, so generating power in space and beaming it down to Earth. And saw that I had a degree in astronomy, and they decided that I must know everything about space technology, so they gave me that job. Well, of course, it's been a long learning experience ever since then. And so it's really accidental that I got involved in space policy work, but I've enjoyed it and I haven't looked back. So, and eventually I wound up being offered the position as Executive Director of Secure World Foundation, and very much enjoyed that experience of engaging around the world with different groups, holding workshops, just the day-to-day business of space diplomacy, really. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Nicola Sasanelli, who I've come to know very well in recent years. And I think you've got also a very interesting story to tell about how you came to be involved in space.
Oh yes, but it's very simple or easier than the Ray. You know, my journey was very simple. I'm a second Italian here. I was a degree in microelectronic engineering, and then I spent the first 10 years of my career in research lab to characterize MOSFET, in particular, component for high reliability for space and military application. So we work a lot with the European Space Agency, the Italian Space Agency, with Marconi in Portsmouth many years ago. Then we moved to Canberra as a scientific attaché of the Italian Embassy for 8 years in order to promote science and technology between Italy and Australia. And then we moved here as, at the beginning as director for R&D collaboration between Europe and South Australia. And since last year, we take this fantastic journey with you. I'm in charge in the state government about the space activity. So very simple.
Thank you. So we'll come back to many of those activities that you've all mentioned, but I think we should start at basic principles. What is space policy and why is it important? And on that particular topic, one thing that you hear very quickly about governmental space policy, the decisions made by governments to do with space, is that so many of the activities are international, and therefore international cooperation is a very big element of space, of the policy of any particular government when it comes to space activity. So my first question for the panel is, Why do you think it is that there is so much international cooperation in space? Very simple question.
You know, I think to some extent it's because of the enormity of the challenges of space. What is not all that well known about the 1960s is that even while the United States and the Soviet Union competed very heavily for the prestige moments of being the first to do something or being seen as the preeminent power in space, they were actually exchanges of scientific information between Soviet and American scholars. And people looking back at this scratch their heads a little bit, since some of those exchanges almost were on the level of what one country or the other could have considered release of important national security information. And yet, one of the reasons that there was at least a policy of tolerance of that was a recognition that the problems were too big to be solved by any one intellect, any one national community of intellects. And I think that led to a habit of cooperation that's sort of repeated regularly since the Apollo-Soyuz mission of the 1970s, eventually the joint space station mission of the 1980s, the exchanges of information about key elements of space technology, especially with space exploration, became a fairly natural part of the system. And now, as we'll probably see later in the conversation, there are all sorts of institutions that facilitate that. Initially, it was very informal. But you know, the International Astronautical Congress that obviously Adelaide will be hosting this September was a place where Russians and Americans regularly got together and had the reputation of not attending the formal sessions very well.
Yes.
Because they were in back rooms talking to each other.
Yes. And the interesting thing was that the Congress started in 1950, which was 7 years before the first satellite, the first human-made satellite. And so the concept of, as you say, of meeting and exchanging scientific information and talking about the future of space was well entrenched during the Cold War and in spite of all the other competition between the superpowers. Right.
I just want to add that in the United States, there's a political element to the cooperation internationally. In the framing legislation for NASA, there's a very explicit direction to NASA to cooperate internationally. And in part, that was to make sure that we reached out to our, quote, friends, end quote, around the world to gain influence in other countries versus the Soviet Union originally. So one mustn't forget that element in the whole thing. And it continues today, by the way. There's just a number of cases, for example, in the Space Shuttle program where the United States would offer a flight to one of the participants in, say, the Brazilian program or other European program and so forth, to essentially to foster that kind of influence throughout the world.
Yes.
Yeah, it's also worth pointing out, Michael, from an Australian perspective, that policy of cooperation paid huge dividends, because the first signals back from Apollo 11 were received on the Australian continent. And perhaps even more dramatically, the first recontact with Apollo 13, which was that ill-fated mission that had to take a huge orbit around the moon in order to have some hope of coming home, were again picked up on the Australian continent. So without participation, without this kind of participatory cooperation, the space program could have had some very different stories.
There is another aspect on international collaboration that we don't have to underestimate. There are a lot of activities lately. I mean, I mainly will be talking about the private aspect of space, but space is all around us. If you talk about space debris, launchers, orbits in LEO, I tell you what, this is involving everyone. Space debris is not just my responsibility, USA responsibility, Italy responsibility, and satellites in LEO, it goes on top of all the world. How are you going to coordinate that? My own experience, this is a global issue. And they're trying to solve it as a global issue, and they're struggling. They are struggling with everything. In a launcher, with an Australian satellite, launched in New Zealand with an American company, you know, from an island in the middle of nowhere, going on top of Africa. Okay, you coordinate that. Okay, this is what's happening. So it's real good, real points, okay, that we need to solve, talking to each other, working together. Lots of, some countries just, they want to put a hand under the sand when we talk about space debris, right? They just don't want to hear it. But how are you going to remove a space debris created from another country? Who knows? Do you know? Do you know if this was from France or from South America? You don't know. So there is an important practical element of collaboration in space activities that cannot be underestimated, okay?
So Flavia, you work for the European Space Agency, and that is a classic example of an international, intercultural, and interdisciplinary activity, which is
correct.
what ISU is founded to promote and teach and improve. So is it much more difficult to work with people of other nationalities and other cultures in space?
Absolutely not.
Be honest.
I'm really honest. Come on, I'm European, so we are used to just to share that little continent with 20 different nationalities, okay? I loved working there. Okay, there are different way of cultures are different no matter what. Europe a different culture, different way of operating. Okay, so the more different way of operating. Some countries are very political. Some countries are not. Okay, so even if you work with an engineer, you see this. Some native culture. If you work with Dutch people, hey guys, they don't want to waste time. If you work with Italians, hey guys, we want to talk. Okay, so it's cultures, it's different. You know, I do miss it. I mean, being here in Australia, I do miss this diversity because you learn a lot. For me, it's all added value. There is no negativity in it, not at all.
Sure. So I should have said at the beginning that...
Yeah, Michael, if...
sorry, Nicola,
No, there are two elements that are very important for international collaboration regarding space. One is that is a fantastic multidisciplinary area where all engineering are involved, from propulsion, energy, avionic, and also it's very expensive. So of course you need to work together in order to achieve some important challenge. And that is experience of the European Space Agency, as well as is the experience of the ISS, International Space Station. And also it's very important because often these science or technological challenge can solve some political issue. In this particular moment, everybody knows about China in ISS. So, no? But, I come from an experience in the Antarctic Treaty in Hobart, where the fishing with the camera was a big issue between UK and Argentina at the time, and then between China and Argentina. So, that is an important issue also for the political environment. When scientists of technological engineering, they talk together. Marco said before, in the 60s, in the 50s, Russian and USA, but the people that work day by day, they talk each other a lot. So that is, I think, is a good approach for the policy too.
I should have said at the beginning that we are being live streamed, and we are encouraging questions from our audience via social media, as well as our audience in the lecture room today. And I'm going to pause at various stages during proceedings to invite questions from you about, hopefully prompted by what you've just heard. So we won't wait till the end. If you have a question, just put up your hand, or if there's a question via social media, Rose will let me know and we'll intervene. So does anyone want to ask anything yet so far? Yes. Just wait for the mic.
Well, considering that there's a new president coming into the White House and there's increasing tensions and generally between Russia and the United States, and Russia and the United States are obviously the main players, from what I understand, in keeping the International Space Station up there. Now, how do you think that's going to play out with all the foreseeable problems that two countries may be facing in terms of the way it will affect the cooperation?
Mike?
Yeah,
Right.
the cooperation that has animated the International Space Station is as good an example of any that has been highly resilient to other geopolitical arguments. Part of that is because not only do Russia and the United States benefit from it quite a bit, because they're now increasingly doing interesting science on the space station, but the other partners are also benefiting. Europe, Canada, Japan are benefiting. And to a large extent, many other countries are benefiting because of data sharing. There's been a substantial amount of scientific data sharing going on. Going forward, my crystal ball is as cloudy as yours about what the relationship between the United States and Russia will be in geopolitical context over especially the next 2 years. You hear comments from President Putin, you hear comments from President-elect Trump. Some of them seem very friendly, some of them seem a little odd. The reality is the space station will probably do quite well. And it may, in fact, be one of those diplomatic links that keeps people saying that cooperation has value even when competition seems to be very popular in domestic politics. And so I would look at the space station that way, and frankly, you'll hear several other international initiatives going on in terms of space science and space applications that also are fairly hopeful in terms of the ability of not just the United States and Russia to get along, but of literally all 63 countries that now operate satellites. And this isn't, this isn't the 1960s anymore. It's a whole new landscape.
Yeah, sorry.
Ray wanted to make a comment.
I wanted to comment
Yeah.
add a comment to this. On a day-to-day level, for example, at the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, where Russia and the US are sometimes on the opposite side of an issue, even there, the discussion goes on. Their delegates try very hard to find a common ground where that they can move forward. And the other thing I would mention is that is a cooperative program called COSPAS SARSAT, which most people have never heard of. And yet, over the years that it's operated, it has led to the rescue of thousands of downed aviators, boats caught in storms, ships at sea, and so forth, and explorers around the world. And because those people who carry a beacon can get picked up by the satellites and beamed to other countries where it's picked up and then passed on, location services and so forth. And that system has existed since the early 80s. And the COSPAS part is originally from Soviet engineers. The SARSAT was from the United States and other Western countries. So it's a very successful program. Nobody ever hears of it, but it's an extremely important one in terms of safety at sea and in the air.
Yeah, don't leave home without it.
Yeah, take your beacon.
Another question from the audience?
Yes, I was just going to, thank you for that. I was just going to follow on from the last question. What is the feeling within the US with the change of president as far as science funding, education? Because, I mean, in Australia we seem to be seeing, I don't know, for lack of a better word, the dumbing down of people in the community, funding of education. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in my entire life, I have never been quite as uncertain about what the future policy environment will be. And that's in part because there are different messages emerging from the Congress, even though it is supposedly of the same party as the incoming president. Then there are from the incoming president, then there are from some of the people that have been nominated to take on key positions. That said, the space endeavor seems to be in reasonably good shape, in part because it seems to meet the political criterion of Mr. Trump to make America great, or at least look great again. And so I'm not sure that I thought that it didn't look pretty good, but space is one place where a lot of prestige can be attached because it attracts enormous media attention, and where, frankly, so little is spent on it relative to other things you could think of, military budgets, for example, that you don't need to add a huge amount by American budget standards to do a lot more. So we might see an acceleration of the Space Launch System program. We may see some more invested in some aspects of the Science Mission Directorate of NASA. I fear we're going to see less invested in Earth science. It seems to be a hot button issue with Mr. Trump and climate change, and we're just going to have to work on that from the grassroots, I guess, in the US. But in terms in general of scientific funding, I think you're going to see some changes in pattern, things that don't seem to match some of the political ideology of the current government may get less well funded. Fortunately, there are, for several of these things, alternate sources of funding, and we may see that. But there are lots of times when I'll look into a crystal ball and be much bolder than I'm being right now. But if there's somebody in America that can really predict what's going to happen over the next year, boy, I'd love to sit at their feet and repeat mantras.
Okay, let's keep moving. In this program, each year we welcome an increasing number of participants from China. And there is no doubt that the Chinese space community is anxious and very, very positive about improving its relations with the other spacefaring nations. What does our panel think the future is of our international cooperation with China in space?
Michael, I think it depends, from a U.S. point of view, it depends very much on whether or not the prohibition that is currently in place about NASA and other U.S. agencies cooperating directly with China. There are signs in the rest of the world that there's a great eagerness to cooperate with China, where the cooperative ventures benefit both sides. And I'm very unhappy that the U.S. Has been prevented for political reasons, pretty narrow political reasons, from cooperating with China. It's very different than our situation with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So, it's a long story, and there's no point in going into it, but if that were to change, then we could see some pretty good changes. Right now, the U.S., the way cooperation gets done is in multilateral forums.
Yes.
So that our people can attend multilateral forums and work directly with their Chinese counterparts in those forums, but not directly U.S. to China officially.
But that said, the Chinese and the Americans have been very creative about using multilateral forums. I was at the high-level forum organized by the UN to prepare Unispace Plus 50, which will be only the fourth conference organized by the United Nations on space policy since the beginning of the space age. The Chinese had a very large delegation there. Part of that was because they're developing very good relations with the United Arab Emirates, and there's been some really solid mutual exchange of information and, in some cases, capital. But they were also frequently seen in conversations with American delegates who were there. There were frequent times when American delegates and certain Chinese delegates were missing from the plenary, where you had a pretty good idea where they all were gathered. So that happens, and mark my words, you will see a lot of Chinese present at the IAC in Adelaide. There will be a lot of Americans at the IAC in Adelaide. They will be attending each other's paper presentations very intentionally, and they will be enjoying moments of quiet conversation in such locations as they can find often. An indication that policy has a complexity to it, has a subtlety to it, but also that this old tradition that space people want to talk to space people has not been done away with, and it's not like Congress doesn't know this is happening. So there's obviously a certain amount of a politics of toleration still in place.
There is an important aspect that I experienced myself, with one of my company, we have been through 6 months of capital raising in the past 6 months. So we're looking at private industry. There is an enormous, the private sector is less influenced by the space policies. That's a reality, okay? There is an enormous interest from China in investing in ventures. And there are a lot of VC firms and billionaires that are actually investing in space. And they're investing in space in China and outside China. I mean, I can recall a couple of conversations that went really far from Chinese investors that wanted to invest in fleet very seriously. I was actually very surprised. There are a couple of companies, actually one of the company was pushed by you, Nicola, and I've never seen operating them this way. So actually really interested in new companies, new space, startups, and actually investigating serious relationships. So I wonder, there is a flavor change. The investment that can come from China could be very significant in the space scenario. Very significant. What it means that can really change laws. There are a lot of people saying that all the space activity happens in Silicon Valley for private, but that's not the case anymore. the Chinese investors, Australian investors, European investors are really, really working and operating like the American VCs. They changed. There's going to be a big change. I'm seeing it. Not really in the past couple of years, not before that. Before that was quite, I don't know what happened in your space policy conversation, but past couple of years, I've seen a big change. And I think China will, with the money they can fill up in the private sector, play a very big role.
Michael, this is not easy, question, and also the answer is not easy.
Yeah.
Is a very complex question, because from one side you have the national security, from the other side you have the national economy. So in some way, in particular in the area like the Pacific, where China is more stronger in the military and the defense stuff, so it's clear that there is a sort of very but at the same time you cannot ignore China. They spend 330 billion USA dollar in research, second just after USA. They spend 4.3 billion just in space. And space started in 1956, then 1970, etc., etc. So it's not easy to say, no, you are not part of this club. So China, as Flavia say, is moving the last 20 years from the rural economy, manufacturing economy, to what somebody call innovation sponge. And now is innovation leader. They are able to buy Lenovo, they are able to buy high-tech company in Germany, in Europe. So you cannot ignore China. So of course you need to work with them, but of course taking count what does mean civil activity and defense. That is an important issues for everybody that is involved in this activity.
Yes, thank you. We'll keep moving, but before we leave the topic of international cooperation, I wanted to ask the panel, or those of you who have an opinion, is it going to be the moon or Mars?
Mars. I'm a big fan of Elon Musk and what he's doing, all that craziness in the private sector. What's happening in the United States, the private sector, what they're pushing to Mars is absolutely incredible. I mean, could seem slightly crazy and overwhelming what they're doing. They're really pushing privately to go and create launchers, to go to Mars, to live in Mars. I think it's a big, big, big vision. It's really big vision. And it's the vision of, I don't know, honestly, the private sector, I'm afraid they can do this, okay? I'm afraid they can actually really put people over there. Mars is my bet. I would like to go. Okay, so if there is a spot, okay, I'd to go and get to know Elon Musk. But for people that doesn't know in this audience, okay, just read the story about what's happening with SpaceX, Elon Musk, and all those activities. It's a story. It's a beautiful story anyway. So
you're saying that it might be the private sector that gets to Mars first?
Yes.
You really think so?
Yes.
Does anyone else agree or disagree?
I don't know. I don't know. This is just the feeling I've got.
Yeah.
These people are rich.
What about the other members of the panel?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear to me that we're going to have some form of either settlement or base development on the moon before we get to Mars. But this either-or question really seems to be unnatural to me. In part because a huge number of the people who want to go to the moon first want to do it because they have a sense that certain key things have to be learned on the moon, are easier to learn on the moon, and then we go on to Mars. Keep in mind that sometime the end of, I think it's this year or next year, the Google Lunar X Prize will have induced a number of people to attempt soft landings on the moon. If they pull that off, there will be a number of companies wanting to take a technology for soft landing on the moon and monetize it. in some ways. So that will be another incentive to do the moon for a while. All the while that's going on, Elon Musk is still trying to make his big rocket. Jeff Bezos is still trying to move ahead with New Armstrong, the rocket that seems not yet to have a destination, sort of like the SLS, the Space Launch System, but which almost certainly is part of a dream of getting to Mars. But there's a lot that's going to happen between now and sometime in the 2030s, when I think we'll have at least orbited Mars with human beings. And if this is a matter of interest to you, there are all sorts of interesting discussions about what to do with Mars, including landing on one of its moons first. It would be so much easier to land on Phobos than it would be to land. Mars is unbelievably hard to land on because it has just enough atmosphere to be a pain in the derriere. And I mean, just keep in mind, people have landed on Mars with rockets, with beach balls, with sky cranes. I mean, we're still looking for the easiest way to get down to Mars, and there's some people that say that we may have to wait till we do space elevators. So it's very, very tough. For the moment, the United States is the only country that's succeeded. It loves to remind you of that. It's also failed half the time. And so it's a very, very hard thing to do. It's easier to land on the moon. It's easier to land on Phobos because you do not have to cope with an atmosphere.
But, you know, going back to your question quickly, you know, it's going to be private race or government race. I don't think it's going to be either one or other. I mean, also if you look at SpaceX, they are not operating disconnected from NASA, not at all. They are operating together, so it looks like it's a completely private push, completely disconnected, but it's not. So even Mars is going to be a collaboration, and there are a lot of things happening, not just Mars per se. There are a lot of companies around the world doing space mining as well. So there are a lot of activities happening in the private sector, not just United States per se.
Question from the audience.
I just want to mention that China, it's pretty clear what their first destination is.
Who?
China?
China, yes. Just wait for
We
the
can't hear you.
microphone.
And neither can the audience.
It's pretty clear what the destination will be for China, and that's going to be the moon, as recently stated in their 5-year plan.
And that's what the European Space Agency is saying as well, that its initial destination is the moon.
Question from our online audience. 6 questions. Well, choose the best.
So entrepreneurs have a different way of talking about advantages in space than policymakers. Do you think that the way space policy is managed is a help or hindrance to entrepreneurs?
Big question. Anyone like to have
You go first. Too afraid
Okay, the
to
one
answer
thing I
this,
will say is I'm sitting on a committee right now, a working group called the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group. And in some ways it leapfrogs over this question because it's the first working group that's aimed at creating policy ideas and policy building blocks that includes entrepreneurs, policymakers, academics, and some large-scale integrator commercial representatives. What's really happening is that we are now integrating a larger community into the discussion of policy. Because although regulation brings terror to the heart of entrepreneurs, even more so is the terror that comes to the heart of entrepreneurs of thinking about trying to create a stable business for which they can raise capital in a Wild West environment. I mean, there's no historic precedent for doing it. So what's exciting is that policy discussions no longer exclude the entrepreneurial or commercial community. Increasingly, members of that community are part of the discussion. It's enriching the discussion, but there's a lot of learning going on both ways, both entrepreneurs learning from policy people and policy people learning from entrepreneurs. So That's a piece of good news in the cooperative environment.
Yeah.
What I think is important now is that everybody, policymaker or entrepreneurs, are oriented to satisfy what we normally call the ecosystem. So the ecosystem, as Mike said, is researchers, teachers, entrepreneurs, private councils, association, because they play an important role. So everybody that is involved in this, they want to have a vibrant ecosystem. So talk each other and grow, sustainable growth. So that is very important. So I can see a lot of connection between entrepreneurs and policymakers, as well as the academic, that is another important stakeholder in this equation.
There is a very important point I want to make. Being an entrepreneur doesn't mean find a way to shortcut space policy. Some entrepreneurs think that's the case, but that's not the case. Because if you're an entrepreneur of a space venture, you will have to face space policy now or in 1 year. I'll give you an example, okay? The goal of my company is to deploy 100 satellites in LEO. Sounds amazing, we've got an amazing business plan, it sounds great, we raise money, we raise capital, fantastic. Do you think it's easy to put 100 satellites in space? Do you think it's not regulated by international collaboration, ITU regulations, launcher certification, you name it? One of the reasons that some companies, some entrepreneurs succeed is because they tackle space policy day one. So it's an interesting way of operating. It's a different speed, and the source of capital is different. But a space policy is space policy. And no matter if the fact that you got a small satellite doesn't mean you have to, I'm not entitled to respect the rules. No, I've got a small satellite. It doesn't work this way, I'm afraid. So I think things are way more connected than what we believe.
Is there one more question before we move on?
The delegates that attend these policy forums, are they generally, let's say, experts in the space field, or are they inundated with lawyers?
When you say, I can answer the lawyer part of your question, but when you say these policy forums, what are you referring to?
Well, you tell me. You mentioned the policy forums.
Well, there are international forums. There's the United Nations. There's the United Nations, but as well as that, there are many multilateral organisations that bring together experts from all around the world. And my experience is that it is a very broad cross-section of expertise, as they're not dominated by lawyers by any means. If anything, they're dominated by the scientists and engineers who are actually leading and managing the programs. But
take the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, for example. It has a scientific and technical subcommittee that really brings together a lot of lawyers, scientists, technical people, engineers. It has a legal subcommittee. And then both those subcommittees report to a general session that has probably a predominant number of political decision makers with technical backgrounds. And so what space has tended to do is to improve the communication between the technical side and the legal side to the point where both perspectives, which seem to be essential to make a policy that can stick, are present in the discussion. And so that's one of the ways the UN deals with the issue. The Group on Earth Observations, which deals with remote sensing issues, has a very highly technical group of participating organizations. The International Telecommunications Union, which deals with the allocation of radio spectrum for use by especially geosynchronous satellites, but pretty much by all satellites, has a very substantial body of technical expertise. So it is not without lawyers, but it's lawyers and engineers and scientists that are talking to each other until trying to find a consensus, since many of these organizations operate not by majority rule, but by consensus.
So let's keep moving, and let's now talk about economics and the economic development of space investment and space projects. To what extent does economics drive space exploration? Can it be justified by, in terms of the jobs and the technology development that space exploration drives, or what are the other factors that persuade governments to invest in space exploration, particularly the major powers? Why do the Europeans do it? Why do the Americans do it? Why do the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians and the Japanese all spend a lot of money on space exploration?
And could you define space exploration for me? Because
Well,
the answer matters.
Yeah, sure. Well, but yeah, okay.
Definitions matter.
The exploration of space beyond Earth orbit for many, many different reasons.
Well, it's primarily seeking new information about the world, the main reason we do science in general. So, yeah, I mean, from the very first attempts to land, or rather to orbit Mars and so forth, the idea was to understand what's going on in that planet, which has garnered so much interest over the centuries. And to answer the question, are there canals on Mars? To be facetious about it, but so you can't discount that. That doesn't have a direct benefit economically to the governments that invest in those systems, but it does have a tremendous benefit in terms of science knowledge gained and a sense that we understand better the universe around us.
I think another thing we need to keep in mind about exploration is that human beings' acquisition of knowledge is often dependent on perspective. That seeing something in one context makes it relatively easy to ignore it, to overlook it, to not understand its importance. So a couple of examples from space that help you see how what really was pure science research eventually led to something that's really proved very useful to us. The first is the interpretation of the data from two pure science projects to Venus. Russia actually landed a spacecraft on the surface of Venus. It's the only country that's ever done it. Not too long before the United States placed a spacecraft in orbit around Venus. Both spacecraft reported the same anomaly. The planet was 200 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than any model predicted it would be. Well, you know, when a scientist sees something like that, they start to drool with anticipation, because this means that there's something they didn't account for, but they now have a clue to what it was. A woman, a scientist in Canada, ultimately took that data, analyzed it, and recognized that the reason why the planet was so much hotter was the abundance of carbon dioxide and the role it was playing in holding heat in on the planet. And you sort of see where I'm going. She then had the presence of mind to see what was happening on Earth with carbon dioxide, and at that time realized that there was a secular, that is a long-term increase in the proportion of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, and it led to our understanding of what we now call greenhouse effect. We did not find greenhouse effect on Earth because the amount of carbon dioxide was increasing fairly slowly. But once we started looking at it, fortunately, we've been able to monitor it since, and we now know that we're over 400 parts per million, and that's not exactly where we want to be, but we now have historic data because we've been looking at it for a while. The second issue is osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a disease that primarily has affected women on Earth. Nobody could figure this out. Didn't make any sense that women got osteoporosis more than men got osteoporosis. But then they started noticing that astronauts coming back from space, once we got smart enough to send both men and women to space, were coming back with almost equal amounts of incipient osteoporosis. It didn't matter. Their gender didn't matter. So what changed? Well, what changed is that body mass and weight were utterly unimportant and utterly unavailable for people floating around a spacecraft, or especially the space station. And we then realized that osteoporosis has a feature in which weight and body mass transmitted through the long bones of the leg that help the body decide how much calcium to put in bones. And many women will notice that if they've ever had treatments recommended for them for osteoporosis, it often includes low impact aerobics and certain actions of that are designed to tell their legs to form calcium in the bone. We didn't know that on Earth. How could we know? We couldn't get rid of gravity. Gravity was the factor. And it was affecting everybody except male body mass was different than female body mass, and it was apparently a significant issue. So those were pure science discoveries. Increasingly, we understand that space exploration is like any other part of pure science. You can't know immediately what it is that a scientific discovery will turn out to be a tool for solving. But we need more tools, because we got plenty of problems. And when people talk about exploring how Mars became so dry, anybody who's ever lived near a desert knows that we're learning something about the extreme case of dryness. Well, knowing something about that may help us with less extreme cases where we'd like to still live in an environment that might otherwise be crippled by drought. So tough to explain that to policymakers sometimes, but when they ask you for a tool and you don't have it, then they might understand.
Yeah. Very important point. But coming back to the economic benefits of investment in space, we have a problem in Australia in that we don't have a long tradition of investment or a continuing permanent national space program, which is supported by continuing government funding. And so the political arguments that you have to make revolve around direct and measurable economic benefit, especially in the area of creation of jobs, but also to a lesser extent in the area of encouraging young people to take up career or study STEM disciplines, and in the hope that they might one day make a career working in something very exciting, such as the sorts of space fields that we've been discussing tonight. But looking for a moment at what's happening in Australia, it does seem to me that the attitude of politicians to space is changing. And I wondered if I could ask Nicola to tell us what you're doing at state government level in this regard, and what your general observations are about the policy environment in relation to space in Australia.
Yes, I can tell you what the South Australian government is doing, but also to do some echo to Michael, is very important in terms of return, economical return, this space exploration. If you try in consideration the last 30, 40, 50 years, if you see the microprocessor high speed, or if you see the use of the titanium everywhere, it's thanks to what we did in the space. So, of course, space is one of the disciplines that drive the innovation. Of course, that is everybody's accepted. So, you know, for example, in the past, USA and now, you know, China, India, that is invested a lot in space is because they are sure about the economic return in this. So just to complete, you know, the space revenue is last year $335 billion USA, and some of our colleagues estimate the revenue in Australia is less than $4 billion. So something is start to be analyzed, and also what's happened in the past. Australia was a leader in the space. It was one of the first country, you know, to design and develop satellites. I think that there are a couple issues. One is there are some priority, and we work very well with some countries like USA and Europe, so a lot of data, a lot of satellites can be easily acquired by our friends. And then if you have a priority, you have to manage this priority, so there are some others. But now, with of course, with this international conference that is coming this year, so all the lights and the spot is on Australia, and in particular in South Australia. So last year we published, we present this strategy for South Australia, and it is a strategy that is articulated in 3 pillars. One is, for us, it's very important to share the importance of space with lay people, with my grandma, with my grandson, because it's important that everybody know the importance of space. Television, mobile phone, broadcasting, forecasting, agriculture, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important to involve the community in this process, because if you have to allocate some money, everybody has to be happy about this money. So this pillar is more or less to set up an hub, managed in particular from the Space Council, that is a group of experts that is give us some idea, give us some direction. The second is related to the innovation. Innovation means lead by private companies. Is the private companies that have to ask to the research center what they want, which research they want to innovate process and product. Is the private company that have to ask the university without the skills people they want in 1 year. Is the private company that are able to push the schools in order to increase the number of students that choose STEMs. So for us, as we are involved about, you know, the economic development of a local area, the leadership of the industry is very important. But of course, the stakeholders are various. Is the academia, is the political, the bank, the venture capital. All of these stakeholders are very important in order to create a vibrant ecosystem. The third pillar that for us is very important is international collaboration. International collaboration, because for a state like us, is very important to be engaged with countries that we consider lead country. And also at state level, we have an important activity of collaboration with India, with China, with Northeast Asia, with North Atlantic area. So for us, it's very important to create add value of this collaboration through the space activity. So this is what we have established last year, and this year is more or less the big challenge is implement this strategy.
So Flavia, you already told us that you've established a new company from here in Adelaide to build and launch a constellation of small satellites to provide internet services to the globe. And that's a fantastic piece of news for anyone who lives here, because it shows that it can be done anywhere in the world. So what would you like to see? You're obviously encouraged by the initiatives of the state government. What would you like to see the federal government doing?
We are live streaming.
Yes. This is your chance to talk direct to the policymakers.
I always say something about Australia, okay? And when I came here, it was 4 years ago, and I saw this amazing group of people, you're part of it, and many in this room try to push and convince politicians, state, federal government. The reality is that I put myself in their shoes. If there are not successful stories, what can they do? I mean, you can tell them that space is awesome, great, and we can have billionaire revenue, but what if there's nothing? So I've seen this politician in the past 3 years looking at this and say, yeah, we do understand it's important, we do understand it's great, but who's actually doing it? When I arrived here 4 years ago, and I'm particularly attached to the new space community and startups, because I think it's a great, just a dynamic environment, okay? When I arrived here, there was a couple of startups. Now I was discussing with some people here, and we think there are 30, 40 in Australia after 3 years, okay? So not all of them will succeed, but some of them they will. So I don't think I want to see anything from them. I just want to look at us. Because now it's time, I'm running a company that raises capital, but I'm not the only one. I think there are a couple of them. There is some companies that are moving from New South Wales to Australia, some company that actually launched the first hardware on a space station from Australia. A lot of things are happening. So now this is the time when years and years conversation get to a point that, hey, people is doing it. So if people are doing it in Australia, what can we do to support them? One thing that I've been struggling as an entrepreneur in Australia compared to some competition in the United States, I've got competitors that for the first 2 years, they were financed by NASA. So entrepreneurs that were financed, and they didn't have to give up all their ideas, all the shares. Here it's all on us. I don't have lots of support, so it's all on us. And that's fair enough, okay, but now it's time for help. Manufacturing satellites is not something cheap. If we have to do it here and not in China, we need support. Manufacturing facilities, really massive support. So now it's time that we have work, as entrepreneur, on our backs, on our shoulders. I'm okay with that, okay? But now we are showing successful stories. Fleet, for example, it's a IoT connectivity company. We try to show the state and Australia and the world that we can actually bring benefit to agriculture, mining, and that's what I like, because it moves economy. So it's not about space per se; it's space for the benefit of Earth. So creating, connectivity for everyone to increase economy. So we have done what we had to do. So now it's time for the federal state, to move and put in place. We got this big dream in Australia about a space. Can I say that? Okay. Can I say that?
So Mike and Ray, I suspect that this sounds familiar from the perspective of people who live in the US. I suspect that the story that Flavia is telling is similar to the story you're hearing from entrepreneurs in the US. Would that be a fair statement?
I think the similarity, and it surprises a lot of people, is the extent to which state governments are very important in the entrepreneurial incubation and nurturing.
Yes.
California, Colorado, Texas, Florida, Virginia, all have substantial programs for encouraging entrepreneurs within their states. But the other piece that I think is similar between the United States and Australia is the role that universities play. You know, it doesn't surprise me that a creative idea about communications satellites would emerge out of South Australia, given the world leadership in telecommunications research of this university. But it's not just the University of South Australia. The University of Adelaide has taken the lead in an international exploration of the law of armed conflict as it applies to space. You know, that's in your own backyard. It's an important issue. You know, we don't want Star Wars in orbit. In Queensland, there's a development of hypersonic technology. Near Sydney, there's some serious development of new algorithms for being able to monitor space weather and deal with the implications of space weather. In Western Australia, you've got a piece of the square kilometre array that is already generating terabytes of data. All of that's going on in an environment where no one can point to a document and say this is an Australian space policy. And one of the reasons for that is that many states have sort of filled in the gap. There's only so long that they're going to fill in the gap before there will be the tangible examples that you're talking about of success that will make federal politicians say, you know, maybe this is an Australian issue and not just individual states trying to fill the fuel tanks of the entrepreneurs in their own communities. And that's encouraging because it says an awful lot about the resilience of entrepreneurs. And certainly for Australians, it says a lot about some pretty creative things that are happening. Let me tell you, if you make a breakthrough in hypersonic propulsion, you will have a world-class major wealth-producing capability because it'll mean that we can get to orbit so much cheaper than by sending gigantic tanks of fuel with tiny payloads into orbit.
Well, hopefully that's prompted a lot of questions or comments from the audience. I see the co-director of the program who wants to say something.
Yeah, basically following from what everyone on the panel has actually talked about, but putting it in the context of, is it first the chicken or the egg kind of thing? Because yes, if we look at the economy of a country and we may think, oh, we don't have enough money to even do the basics, imagine if we can run a space agency or support space entrepreneurs. But the reality is, and I think it's been demonstrated, that if you invest in education, research, entrepreneurship in the way that Flavia suggested, actually that's what improves the economy. So there is a linear versus an exponential growth. So the first thing really has to think about, yes, I'm spending today, but the return is going to be much, much bigger. And that's never actually mentioned. What we look at is always, but this costs too much.
Yeah, or how quickly will we see that economic return? And sometimes you can't tell.
All of the developed countries, and Nicola mentioned it, even the countries that are trying to develop are investing in research.
Yes.
Okay? And among those also space research.
Yeah.
It's not like they're stupid. They're doing it because they have seen evidence that that brings to that fast development that you're looking for.
Yes. Any other questions or comments? Anything from, yes, the social media?
So, has international space policy come too late to stop irreparable damage to the space environment from space debris?
Well, that was going to be the last part of our session.
There you go.
And I'm not sure that we're going to have time to dwell on space security and those problems, but yes, it is a very big part of international space policy. but we might have to have a separate public panel on that topic. Any other questions?
Okay, so what are your thoughts about the recent interest of Latin America in space and their status in space policy?
Latin America has really emerged with leadership from Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico in what amounts to policy not unlike the way Australia is behaving. That is, very, very interested in the use of satellite technologies for direct applications on Earth. Mexico has been extremely effective in the use of now open data sets to actually combat fishing piracy off their coast. Chile has been using space-based assets to measure changes in the Andes Mountains. Brazil continues to have substantial interest in re-emerging as a country capable of its own independent launch capability. Increasingly, Latin America sees this tied to economic development. And as one Latin American mentioned to me last year at the Space Symposium in Colorado Springs, participating is important in and of itself. If you want to help make the rules, you need to play the game. And there are a lot of countries that are recognizing that that is true. You have more credibility when talking about what the rules should be if you're engaged in the activity.
Question from the audience.
Hello? Okay. This is a question for Mr. Sasanelli. Is one of the things that the state government could do is could something like the CubeSat launch initiative that the NASA does in the US, where basically NASA says to universities and schools and individuals, you build the satellite and we'll launch it for you. Is that something that the state government could do?
State government or Commonwealth government? Oh, state government, I think, is... look, one of the priority for us is the Nano Satellites, because we believe that the future is this, and if you have to prioritize some activity, is one of the important activity for us is the Nano Satellites. So we have a good example, Flavia and Matt Innova, that they were part of the QB50. So one of the 4 Nano Satellites was developed last year, were developed here in Adelaide. And also the Flavia and the fleet has a very ambitious challenge. 100 satellites in a constellation is something that is really important for the state if this is developed in South Australia. So the answer is yes, is a priority for us. We try to help, we try to work together, but I don't think that we have some, some idea in terms of program related to the launch of nano satellites. Also because part of this activity is done by private company, for what I understand. The one in Rock Lab in Wellington is an entrepreneur that is, and also Elon Musk is doing something alone with ambitious program of one launch every week. So it's something that is more related to private area than us.
Okay, our allotted time has elapsed, and I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your attention and for your intelligent questions. And and we hope that you come to our future events. I'd also like to acknowledge the program sponsors, and in particular the Sir Ross and Sir Keith Smith Fund, the Secure World Foundation, whom you've heard about this evening, the European Space Agency, the Ray Williamson Fund, thanks to our colleague Ray, Sky and Space Global, the Heinlein Trust and NASA. And as well as that, we have a large number of event sponsors, and you're all invited to attend a very important event this coming Sunday at McLaren Vale, where we will launch one of 2 simultaneous small satellites on helium balloons up to the stratosphere. And I'll now call upon the program director, Dr. Omar Hatamale, to close the proceedings and tell you a little bit more about our future events.
Thanks, Michael. Well, first I would like to thank all of you for joining us this evening for the Space Policy Panel. I would like to thank our moderator, Mr. Michael Davis, and our distinguished panelists here today, Ms. Flavia Nardini, CEO of LaunchBox and Fleet Space, Dr. Ray Williamson, international space policy expert and former USA Congress advisor for space, Dr. Michael Simpson, executive director of the Secure World Foundation, and Mr. Nicola Sasanelli, director of research and development for the International Collaborations for Defense SA. So there's several events happening this week as part of this Southern Hemisphere Space Studies program. The first one is going to be this Sunday, and it's going to take place at 10 o'clock at Serafino Wines at McLaren Valley. And the objective of this stratospheric balloon launch, participants are going to develop 2 payloads equivalent to nano CubeSats. And they're going to be launched to approximately 40 kilometers. And when they go up, they're going to take pictures, and the pictures will be downloaded and analyzed real time. So it's a kind of analog of launching CubeSats and then having that assessment happening real time. On Monday, we're going to have actually the Ethics of Space Exploration panel. It's going to happen here at 6 o'clock in this specific room as well. And then on next Friday, we have an interesting lecture called Life in the Universe, Are We Alone? And that's going to take place at 6 o'clock at City Campus East. So with that, I would like to conclude this panel. I would like to welcome all of you guys to a reception afterward. Thanks a lot for coming. Enjoy it.